God may be responsible for everything, but that doesn't mean God's indictable. You may be responsible for having a child, but that doesn't mean you're indictable for everything the child does.
Welcome to Thinking About God podcast from Dr.Barry Whitney. This is the second episode in Dr. Whitney's God and Evil series. The series explores the problem of reconciling belief in God with the suffering, injustice, and evil in the world. In this second episode, Dr. Whitney discusses why the problem is so threatening to belief and why monotheistic religions like Christianity have a unique problem of evil. He shows how the problem has been formulated and then responds to some of the arguments used by skeptics to reject belief in God based on these formulations. This podcast is an edited version of one of Dr. Whitney's lectures from his university course titled God and Evil.
What we have to do today is set up the problem so that we can spend the rest of the term trying to answer the problem. You know, there's nothing worse than answering a problem that you don't have. So we have to show you today that there is a serious problem. Belief in God is denied a lot of people, or obstructed by a lot of people, or challenged by a lot of people. It's hard to believe in God when there's so much misery and suffering in the world. That's the problem. One of the trilogies that Elie Wiesel wrote is called Night, the true story about being inside Auschwitz. The captors decided to hang 3 people. One of them was a young boy. Elie Wiesel tells this story. And of course, the young boy was too light to die instantly. So he was there strangling. And of course, these people in Auschwitz are muttering, "Where's God? Where's God in this?" One of them said, according to Elie Wiesel, he's just died there on the gallows. If there was a reason for people not believing in God, it's that kind of human misery that we cause each other. You can't put a figure on it, but the majority, maybe 90% of all suffering that you and I have experienced is caused by other human beings. It's not caused by natural disasters, but it's caused by us. Some people make a case that all suffering is caused by us, all of it. Even the natural disasters, it's our fault because we don't have the brains to put up decent housing in certain places. I think that might be a stretch to say it's all our fault, but I think most of it's our fault. That's a very simple way to cut through all the words and say the reason we suffer is that God created us with the power to cause such misery to one another. That's part of the answer. The question then would be, why did God create creatures with this kind of power? Why doesn't God intervene to prevent the worst sufferings then? So it's not as easy as saying it's caused by us, it's not caused by God. You hear this in sound bites. If you call up a radio show and why do you think that people suffer? And they say, well, God gave us free will. We use our free will for evil. It's our fault. Yeah, but why did God give us so much free will? Why didn't God create creatures that had a little more propensity to be good instead of evil? There's still questions to answer. It's not that simple. So hopefully no sound bites here, but a little more rational, reasoned approach. There's no more difficult question for anybody who believes in God than this one. The top of the list, I think I said last time, a distant second would be naturalism, atheism, the belief that science gives us the only truth. That's why I have a class on Tuesday on God and atheism. That's the other main reason people don't believe in God, because science defines the world in scientific terms, things we can see, taste, touch with our 5 senses, and they don't allow for the supernatural. So science is a serious threat. I was just showing the class on Tuesday. It's a web document called Belief in God by Scientists, and it's really quite shocking. The leading scientists who believe in God are the mathematicians. They pull in at 14%. 14% of mathematicians believe in God. The worst among the scientists are the biologists. 5.5% of them believe in God. The rest of the scientists are pretty much agnostic, don't care, it doesn't affect their work, it's just irrelevant. There's the word theos in Greek meaning God, dike, D-I-K-E in Greek meaning justice. A philosopher in the 18th century, Leibniz, invented the word. He coined the word Theodicy. He combined the word God and justice. That word is asking a question. Is God just? Is God just in allowing or creating a world with so much suffering? Leibniz was a German who actually wrote a book in French called Theodicy, and that's where the word comes from. The original version of that was with a capital, Theo, Theodicy. Is God just? Now, this doesn't mean that we didn't ask the question, is God just, before Leibniz? But Leibniz is kind of the modern resurrection of the problem. See, we thought we had it solved for centuries. Before there was science and atheism and a competing worldview, there was just Christianity for most people in Western Europe. And it was a mystery to most people, but most people simply had faith that somehow evil had and suffering had a meaning. They were taught that sometimes suffering is a test of faith, sometimes suffering is punishment, sometimes suffering is a way to become more spiritually mature. Some suffering could be punishment if we take the Old Testament and the New Testament seriously, but not all of it. Some suffering might be a test of faith, but not all of it. You can't just say every time you're not feeling well, it's God's testing your faith. But we had these kind of a wishy-washy mixture. It wasn't very systematic. We never really took this problem seriously because the problem of evil is challenging belief in God. And people didn't have a problem. They believed in God, so they figured there must be a reason. Why should we think that we can understand it? The vast majority of people believed in God. It wasn't fun to suffer, but everybody believed in an afterlife. In fact, in the Middle Ages, people focused on the afterlife. We still have a little bit of residue of that. It's not a good plan to just kind of grit your teeth and get through this life and think about the afterlife. I think we have to worry about this one and make it the best place we can and help other people and do things here. But in the Middle Ages, life was cheap. There was disease and famine and all kinds of horrible things going on. So these people had nothing to look forward to except an afterlife. What happened after that is that a competing worldview began. Galileo, Laplace, Kepler, all of these major scientists of 300 or 400 years ago slowly started to interpret the world naturalistically. Galileo showed that the Earth isn't the center of the universe, and Kepler showed that the planets aren't semi-divine, moving in circles around the Earth, but they're actually in a strange elliptical orbit. To make a very long story short, people didn't have a serious problem of evil until there was scientific atheism out there, challenging belief in God and challenging us to explain how you can believe in God. When you have atheism telling you there is no God and they use the problem of evil as their main argument, we better have a response. You know that Augustine in the year 400, St. Augustine gave us what is the most influential solution to the problem of evil right to this day. St. Augustine was a bishop of the early church around 400. He died when Rome was falling around 432. Rome fell in 410, and then Augustine died in 432. He watched Rome collapse. He watched the world become chaos. But he wrote a ton. Some call him the first psychologist. He wrote a book called Confessions, another one called The City of God, just masterpieces of theology. St. Augustine also solved the problem of evil, supposedly. And it's amazing how Catholics and Protestant Christians still use his solution with a little tweaking here and there. He's the dominant figure. He made mistakes, I think. I don't think we can just take it over. It's not perfect. But what I'm saying is, even though Leibniz started this thing in the 17th century, like a philosophical defense of God, way back in 400, we were explaining why there is suffering and misery in the world. If you're Catholic, you know that after Augustine, if Augustine is the 5th century, Leibniz here is the 17th, the other huge name in theology is St. Thomas Aquinas, 13th century. He wrote volumes and volumes and said an awful lot of things about how you solve the problem of evil. He is still the major Catholic solution to this issue. His first name was Thomas Aquinas, so his thought is called Thomism, after his first name. We only have 4 huge names in theology that all solve the problem of evil kind of differently. You know what happened is Augustine was used by Thomas, and hence the Roman Catholics use Augustine through Thomas Aquinas, and Luther and Calvin used Augustine to form the Protestant solution to the problem. A huge part of the church was in the East, the Orthodox Church. They split off from the main body in 1050. They have a completely different solution. St. Irenaeus, way back in the 200s, he died around 202. He was the Bishop of Lyon, France. He solved the problem of evil in his way. Augustine solved it in his way. So in the 2nd century, we have a solution. In the 5th century, we have the 2 main Christian solutions. Christians have a very, very unique problem of evil, and they need a unique solution. Mono means one, so belief in one God. Now, if you believe that there's one God who created all things, it's not a very big stretch to say, well, if God created all things, isn't this God responsible then for everything? All the good and all the evil? That's a fair question. We're going to formulate the problem of evil. If you've read some of the readings you've seen, that's how we do it. We say, God is all-powerful. That's a basic monotheistic belief. God is all-loving. That's a basic belief. Yet, evil exists. And it's genuine evil. It's not an illusion. It's genuinely evil. How can that be? What I'm doing now is I'm basically giving you what's called the logical problem of evil. What it's saying is, basic belief for theists, for monotheists, is number 1, God is all-powerful, omnipotent, and the word is pronounced omnipotent. So omnipotent, all-powerful, God is omnipotent. That's our first basic belief. That's what a monotheist believes. We also believe that God is omnibenevolent, which means all-loving. God is all-powerful, omnipotent, omnipotent. God is omnibenevolent, all-loving. And God is all-knowing, omniscient. All-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing. And then we try to defend that understanding of God, because we can't deny that understanding, with the existence of evil. If you go to that God and evil link, chapter 1, right? If some of you have done that, you've seen it, so I don't have to go through all this, but you need to read these things at some stage. C.S. Lewis said, for instance, you get about 5 or 6 different versions of this formulation starting on, you don't have pages. Page 3 it really is where it starts. C.S. Lewis says, if God were good, if God were all good, God would wish to make his creatures perfectly happy. And if God were all-powerful, God would be able to do what he wished. But the creatures aren't happy. Therefore, God either lacks goodness or power or both. That's the challenge. We believe God is all-powerful, God is all-loving, but if God is all-powerful, that means God can do anything. If God is all-loving, that means that God would only do what is loving and has the power to do it. Why then is there evil? That's the question. That was a theist I just read, but you can turn the page and read the same challenge from an atheist like David Hume. Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then God would not be all-powerful. Is God able, but not willing? Then God would not be all good. Is God both able and willing? Whence then is evil? Read God and Evil chapter 1 and get an idea how you formulate this question. And I've given you that web link, too, by McCallum. What he does there is he gives you 4 versions. These are atheistic protests against belief in God. This is how they formulate the issue, and this is how theists formulate the issue to answer the protest. We don't have a problem with this. Is there a logical contradiction in holding 3 propositions, that God is all-loving, God's all-powerful, and yet evil exists? Atheists have said this is a logical contradiction. They're wrong, I'll show you, but that's been the challenge for a long time. And it's still out there. They still write web documents and books like we haven't solved this problem. If God is perfectly loving, see, they're saying if God really is omnibenevolent, then God would he would wish to abolish evil. If God really is all-powerful, God would be able to abolish all evil, but evil exists. So God must not be all-powerful or all-loving, one or the other, or maybe both, or maybe God doesn't exist. There are still people walking the face of the earth, teaching classes and writing books that will tell you that this is a logical contradiction. If God were all loving and all powerful, there wouldn't be any evil. That's what they're saying. But because there is evil, God can't be all loving and God can't be all powerful. If that were true, if God isn't all loving, it's not God. It's something else. If God isn't all powerful, we're not talking about God. If there's a logical contradiction, we better find it. And if there isn't, we better show there isn't. And that's what we've done. Do you know where that happens? It's in the Encountering Evil book, chapter 3, by Davis. And he shows you the logical problem of evil, how you can respond and defend belief in God against the atheist saying it's a logical contradiction. You can't believe all three at the same time. It's a contradiction. God's all powerful, God's all loving, evil exists. There's a simple way to solve that. I want to show you just how slippery the language could be. This one is not very impressive, but there are a lot of people who say, I don't believe in God because of 1, 2, therefore 3. And what do they say? God's the author of everything. Evil is something. Therefore, God must be the author of evil. Maybe at first blush, you're thinking, that sounds right. God's the author of everything, and evil exists, so God must cause all the evil. And I'm sorry to say that a lot of people who do believe in God have fallen for that. A lot of people do blame God for all evil and all suffering. That, to me, if God causes all the evil and all the suffering, I'd be hard-pressed to defend that God as being good. You could be the author of everything, like God's the author of everything, and yes, evil is something, but it doesn't follow that therefore God does everything. It's like saying you've had a child, you and your husband were the author of that child, you were the full reason for that child's existence, therefore you are responsible for everything the child does. It's kind of the same by analogy. Just because God is the creator of all things doesn't mean that God has created evil. It could mean that God has created in us the ability to give rise to evil. God may be responsible for everything, but that doesn't mean God's indictable. You may be responsible for having a child, but that doesn't mean you're indictable for everything the child does. God could easily have created us as the author of all things with the ability of freedom, and that's what we believe God did. He created us with the ability of free choice. I don't know if you see this yet. This is really early in the term. I mean, you'd have to finish this off and put a 4 there and say, therefore, God can't be all good. And number 5 would be, and if God is not all good, then it's not the Jewish, Christian, Muslim God. So that God can't exist. God has to be all good. God has to be all powerful, or it isn't God. For anybody to say, if God is the creator of this universe, and God is good, and God is powerful, the world should be perfect. There shouldn't be any evil and any suffering. I hope you know what you're asking. That seems to me the skeptic's mind. That's what they're really saying in this one. God's the author of everything. God created everything, supposedly, you Christians, Jews, and Muslims believe, and some others. Evil is part of that creation, so God can't be good, therefore God's not God. It sounds logical. But it's like saying, unless the world is perfect without evil, I won't believe in God. Yeah, I can tell you a way for God to make the world perfect without evil. God could simply make little gods, little clones, and they would be basically less than robots. They would simply be meaningless. Free will is the most incredible ability, the most incredible attribute a human being has. Free will. The power to reject the Creator, the power to destroy the world almost, the power to make people's lives miserable by the droves or millions. It's a powerful thing that we have. It makes us human. It distinguishes us from microphones and trees and whatever. And yet that free will can't be only used for good, because if God gave you free will and forced you to use it for good all the time, it's not free will. I'm just trying to give you an idea of how people challenge belief in God with simple little arguments like that. I don't think because you have a child you're indictable for what the child does. You're responsible for having a child. God's responsible in a way as the Creator, but that doesn't mean every miserable evil that we freely choose is God's fault, and therefore God isn't good. No, we have to go farther, though, and say that we need to know some of the good reasons why God would create us free, and I think the options are the good reasons. If God didn't create us with some freedom, then what good would it be? There's nothing in it for God, there's nothing in it for us. We also have to have some good reasons why God doesn't intervene all the time and prevent all these evils. This one's far too simplistic. It's really saying, I want a perfect world, then I'll believe in God. To have a perfect world, there can't be any creature with free will, is the simple answer to that one. Hope it doesn't sound like a soundbite, but it's that simple. This one is just a clear mistake. God made everything perfect. Imperfection can't come from perfection. Therefore, perfectly created beings can't be the origin of evil. Therefore, God must be the origin of evil. Without going through the litany of this, because you can read this later, but that first proposition, God made everything perfect. I, for one, would say that that's not how I read Genesis, the Hebrew Bible that's used by Jews and Christians. God didn't create the place perfectly. God created it good. There's a big difference. Perfect means you can't do evil. But the only way you can't do evil is if you don't have free will. Like, God created it good. This is a good creation. That's what the Bible says. It doesn't ever say this is a perfect creation, because it knew it can't be perfect. God said it was good. It was good after the first day. It was good after the second. So this one is saying, God made everything perfect, and where did the evil come from? It must have come from God then. But it doesn't make any sense. If you have a false proposition in one of these arguments, it just kills the whole argument. I don't have to go by number one in that one. This last one, there's only 4 that you need to look at. And then God and evil, that little link, chapter 1, just get some idea how we set this thing up. If God is all good, he would destroy evil. If God is all-powerful, he could destroy evil, but God has not destroyed evil, therefore there's no such God. The very simple solution to that one from a Christian, Jewish, Muslim perspective is God could destroy evil, and God will, but he hasn't done it yet, and there's probably good reason. It's that simple. I just pity people sitting in a philosophy class, somebody trying to shove atheism down your throat saying, there it is again. God could destroy it. God should destroy it if God's all loving and all powerful, but he hasn't, so can't be a God at all. The simple solution is not yet. On whose time are we? Ours or God's? If there's one thing in the universe that has patience, believe me, it's God. We always talk about the patience of Job, the innocent man who suffers, but God had to be patient through all his harangue.
The class references mentioned in this podcast include Dr. Whitney's book, God and Evil, which was originally published by Paulist Press. Dr. Whitney has 3 or 4 chapters of this book available for downloading on drbarrywhitney.com. The other references mentioned in the podcast include the Encountering Evil book, edited by Stephen Davis, and a web document by Dennis McCallum called The Problem of Evil, found on xenos.org. For more details about the course readings, check the class notes link on drbarrywhitney.com. Please join Dr. Whitney for the rest of this podcast series on God and Evil. The content of this podcast is the property of Dr. Barry Whitney.